Okay. Connected. Okay, with the permission of the judges, I would like to start the first argument. Sorry. Of the opposition. Good afternoon, everyone. First and foremost, I'd like to thank your presence here. It's very rewarding to see so many people attending this event, even in these awkward times that we live. So the first round of arguments of the opposition will be based on basically three lines of argument, right? The first line, the opposition understands that taking down these cartoons does not mean people will not watch it. This is our first argument. Second, not watching is not an option. Keeping people from having access to these cartoons is not an option. We live in the age of the internet and the age of information. These people can get this kind of cartoons and even worse content if they search for it. So the question we must ask ourselves is not whether we are stopping people from watching them, but which kind of access do we want to grant them to these cartoons? In the third and last line of argument, by taking these cartoons down, we would have to take down a whole bunch of books, movies, paintings, because trust me, if you read any Western literary work from the late 19th and early 20th centuries, you will see, guess what? Racism, even worse than you can see in these cartoons. Okay? So to my first line of argument, taking down these cartoons from circulation, removing them from circulation will not stop people from watching them, right? If Disney stops encouraging the circulation of these cartoons, people will find them on the internet, on the deep web, on the normal web, right? So we cannot really afford to how can you say, to try to stop these cartoons from circulating. And let me give you an example that sheds some light on my point. I believe many of you have heard about the book Mein Kampf, which was written by Adolf Hitler in 1920s. For many, many years, this book was forbidden in Germany and it couldn't be circulated, right? Does that mean that neo-Nazism stopped in Germany after this book was not circulated? No. The number of neo-Nazi movements rose increasingly in Germany throughout these years. So the German authorities, they came up with a much smarter solution. Let's not abolish this book. Let's publish this book, but with a critical edition that shows readers that, look, you are reading this, but this is all nonsense, right? So the second point of my argument, we cannot afford to stop people from accessing these cartoons. They will always have access to it. What we must ask ourselves is not whether people will watch them or not, but what kind of understanding they will have from these cartoons, right? So do we want them to have a guided access to these cartoons? Then we should hold these companies responsible and make sure that they release other versions of these cartoons, just like they did with the Mein Kampf in Germany, and say, look, this is a portrayal from something from the early 20th century. We cannot expect them to have the same values that we have, right? So we must understand that what you're watching now is not correct. It's completely wrong. And if we have, if we allow companies to continue circulating these cartoons, they will have this opportunity of correcting their mistakes and of being held accountable for their past mistakes, right? And one of the first speaker has said that we must acknowledge racist history, that we must make sure that children don't have access to these cartoons. So if we stop these cartoons from circulating, they will still have access to it, but they will have a non-critical access, which is what you can find in the deep web, right? And now the third line, so let's suppose, for example, sexual education, right? If parents stop talking about sex with their children, does that mean their children will be not interested in sex, or that they want to learn from sex, about sex from other people? So what parents must ask themselves is, do I want my children to learn about sex from me, or from their friends, or from the internet? Yes? Okay. So let's suppose, so forbidding does not solve the problem. It just postpones the problem, right? Forbidding does not address the problem, because it keeps these companies from being held accountable, right? So we must avoid the ostrich policy. We must avoid this idea that by forgetting the past, we will not repeat its mistakes. And now to the third and last argument. Taking these cartoons out of circulation will just entail taking almost all literature from the 19th century out of circulation. Do you really think that only these cartoons are racist? Do you really think that they are the main chapter of the history of racism, right? And removing means forgetting, and forgetting means not learning from the past. This is why it is important for these cartoons to continue being circulated, but to ensure that they have a critical approach.
Members of the House, please make sure that you do not raise a point of information in the first and the last minute of the speech.
So it turned out to be, this.
Okay. We would now like to call upon the Deputy Prime Minister to deliver a speech of not exceeding 6 minutes.
With the permission of the adjudicator? Oh. Mhm. Right. With the permission of the adjudicator? Esteemed audience, ladies and gentlemen, when they cut off your ear, when they don't like your face. It's barbaric, but hey, it's home. Does the opposition think that that a small description in the beginning of a whole movie makes it okay, acknowledges these blatant, disgusting racial stereotypes that are present in movies and songs and caricatures that are made by major media producing countries? Do you think it's okay? Does that small description acknowledges the decades, the centuries, the years, the generations of stereotypes that have caused the culture, the minorities, the underrepresented people? Does this acknowledge the harm that the movies and these media have caused? Moving on to our first line of argument, by removing these caricatures, by removing this problematic media, what we do is that we recognize the historical racism that is present in Disney, in the movies produced by Disney. This, in turn, will shatter echo chambers that have formed around this topic for generations. By doing so, we will have a constructive discourse around this topic, meaning that this will educate people that why these stereotypes are wrong. This also will ensure that companies like Disney are not allowed to do this again. They're not this will ensure that they're not allowed to monetize on the stereotypes, on the discrimination of the culture, of the people, and of the underrepresented minorities. A point that the opposition made was that taking down is not an option. Why? Taking down ensures that there's less propagation of this media. Another point, interesting point, that the opposition made that even if we remove these movies, these caricatures, these songs, they're still available on the deep web. But what we're trying to do is that we're trying to stop children from internalizing the cycle of discrimination from formative years. But do children have access to deep web? Me, you, the general audience, they don't have access to deep web. By ensuring that these are removed from the mainstream media, this will ensure that people who are easily influenced cannot have access to this stereotypical movies and media. Another point that the proposition made, that if we do so, we will have to remove a lot of media. Does this mean that even if a lot of the media is racial, is stereotypical, does that make it right? If something is wrong, but it is widely spread, does that make that wrong thing right? No, it does not. Moving on to our second line of argument, this removal of movies, stereotypical expressions of the culture of the minorities, this creates a safe space for the minorities, for the underrepresented people. Because of this media, there are reduced to 2D characters that are demonized. Say the Arabs are described as barbaric, the Africans as undereducated, the Chinese as being very cunning. This harms their culture, this harms their children, this harms the entire community as a whole. When a child of the minority sees this media widely spread on TVs, and what do they think of themselves? They see themselves reflected in these characters. What do you think what will happen to them? This causes an internal self-doubt and misrepresentation of their own culture. They see themselves reflected in these people, which destroys their entire personality, their entire culture. We want to create a world where people do not see themselves reflected in these characters. They aren't reduced to being 2D characters. Another very interesting point is that one day Disney did not grow a conscience. It did not get a revelation that, oh, what we're doing is wrong. Why this happened, why they started adding descriptions in front of the movies is because of the Black Lives Movement, the BLM movement. When people ask for their rights, Disney realized that if they don't comply with them, they won't remain as the mainstream media outlet that they are. If they don't, they will lose money. This is all about monetization. This isn't because Disney realized, oh, we're wrong, we shouldn't be doing this. It's because if they did not, they would lose capital. By removing these caricatures, we ensure that other corporations cannot monetize on this. Because if they do, the rights that people of color, that underrepresented minorities, that Africans, all these people that they fought hard for their rights, they are being taken back because this media is still in circulation. When other people, let's say someone younger, sees these type of racial stereotypes in movies, what do they think when they meet, say, a black person, a person of color, a Chinese person? They have this internalized idea of what the person will turn out to be. This will harm not only that person that is at the end of this discrimination, this will also harm the entire culture, and thus a cycle of discrimination begins yet again. To stop this cycle from continuing again, we want to stop the circulation, to stop the propagation of these media. We believe that in a world where this media is not shown, it will help the people, the minorities, gain back their identity back, and a place where they're not reduced to the characters of themselves. Thank you.
We would now like to call upon the Deputy Opposition Leader to deliver a speech of not exceeding 6 minutes.
Please do let me know when to start. Should I? Okay. Respected adjudicators and fellow audience, thank you very much for this opportunity for speaking on this very important motion, an important yet highly misunderstood notion. The proposition came up and gave a very good case, apparently, but I think that their understanding of racism is extremely flawed and extremely shallow. And that is what we are trying to tackle here. The proposition came, their second speaker came, and they repeatedly said that we are, by the mere act of removal of these caricatures which are allegedly racist, we are actually trying to portray or trying to guard someone's rights. Well, first of all, let's have a very clear grounding here. The problem of racism is well acknowledged by the opposition as well. That's not even up for debate. Racism is a problem that needs a serious solution to it. The thing that is at debate is that how should we tackle it? Should we just simply take down these caricatures which are allegedly racist, or should we look for a more sustainable solution? What the proposition is actually offering, it's just a pseudo-moralistic perspective, which is only looking for cosmetic and yet very convenient options to go for these policy options. Well, that is not a sustainable solution. For example, they say that the circulation of these Disney cartoons is actually going to instill some biased presuppositions in children's mind. Well, are you just trying to imply that Disney is children's babysitter? Well, no. Disney is not the only thing that's actually raising those kids up. Are kids only being exposed to Disney cartoons? Are there not other sources of cartoons which they might be watching? What is your solution to it? Like my fellow teammate argued that there are so many different other forms of art. So if your solution is rather take down all of these allegedly racist content, then there is apparently no solution, because you are fundamentally confusing two things. There is a symptom, and then there is a cause that you need to understand. What you are rather groping at is a symptom. If a racist content is coming up, it is rightly a reflection of racism. Fine, it is. We agree with you on that ground. But that is a mere symptom, because if you today take down one content, tomorrow another symptom will come up, because you are not sincerely willing to tackle the systemic issues which exist. You are not sincerely willing to look at the ingrained racism in the society itself. So that makes me question the very sincerity of the very premise that you are bringing here, that you are just sufficing and agreeing that this taking down of racist content is more than enough. Well, in that case, I really question the sincerity being portrayed here by the team proposition. The second argument, which was basically repeatedly talked about, that we really need to acknowledge the whole lot of the generations of struggles that these people, the racist, the victimized basically have traversed over the period of time and experience. Well, yes, we agree with that. There is no problem. There is a whole lot of a struggle that was run for generations. But are you trying to say that acknowledging that entire journey is only possible through taking down these racist contents? Let me tell you how this is flawed. One, when you are basically trying to erase the past. If you are erasing this, look at this from a very constructive perspective here. You're saying that there's a generation of struggle that the victims basically ran. I look at the racist content which was created in the past, now being viewed from the present lens, which automatically
On
is a
that
very,
note, sir.
very flawed view of history itself. Yes, please.
Are you saying that is opposition believing that acknowledging something is erasing it from existence, is erasing history?
That's the very flaw of the proposition itself, that you're not really understanding what is being written and what is being said. You have to understand this is not what I said. Our point is that we do acknowledge that there has been a struggle going on by those who are victimized. But recognition of that struggle does not mean that you just simply take down these content, which is just a cosmetic approach towards solving the issues. So our proposition is the racist content which was created in the past was not regarded as racist back then. It's being regarded as racist now. This itself is a progression of humanity. This should tell you the journey that we have traversed over the period of time, that we are more humane now than we were previously. You are completely erasing that history, that progression that humanity has actually made. So therefore, I think that the entire case that you are trying to build is basically very, very flawed and does not stand on right footings, because you have absolutely no idea as to what is the difference between past, present, and future, because you are going to spend your present to undo your past, and then tomorrow in the future, you look back towards the past that you just simply messed it up because you didn't really do anything. Because if a child is being exposed to this content, which you think is racist, distracted here. So if the child is being exposed to this racist content and you think that this is just instilling the biased perceptions in the child itself, well, what if we take down the Disney cartoons and the parents themselves are racist? How can you guard the child? Can you guard the child in that regard? It's a question which I would really want to hear the answer of. So building on this, I think there are very rational grounds that we can talk about. So you need to understand the difference between the cause and symptom. You need to understand that this journey that we have traversed over the period of time basically is itself, this racist content now being regarded as racist is basically a progression of humanity. And thirdly, you have to understand that reparative future is what we are aiming for. And for that, you have to acknowledge what happened in the past. It depends, it's a two-way street. What has happened, if I have slapped someone back in time, I cannot undo. I mean, you can't erase that. I have to apologize today. And that apology does not necessarily mean that I just simply take down these, but rather make sure that this does not happen again. So therefore, the success of tackling racism would rather be that this racist product is not reproduced. Thank you very much.
We would like to now call upon the last speaker of proposition, the government whip. Okay, so before we start the last speech from the side proposition, please do not tap during the speech because the speaker might get confused with your tapping and the timekeeper's tapping. You're allowed to tap at the end of their speeches. Thank you, and please do not talk.
With the permission of the adjudicators, thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen of this house, talking about flawed arguments, let us start with how the opposition has misconstrued the argument into making us believe that it is about completely ending racism. Ladies and gentlemen, it is not. They talk about how solving a symptom won't fix the entire problem. Ladies and gentlemen, that is exactly what proposition stands for. It is not going to solve the problem, but it will make the problem easier to solve because you're starting at a certain place. Proposition never argued that removing these cartoons from circulation will end racism for everyone. No, proposition argued that these systematic steps that the opposition keeps on bringing up in the second speech, that they're talking about systematically tackling these things. Well, this is part of systematically tackling racism, because you're trying to bring into the mind of these multinational corporations, of these large corporations with a huge audience base, that they cannot get away with a certain degree of problematic views, that they cannot continue to monetize on these specific issues. Let us talk about a few of the rebuttals that we would want to make. In the first speech, the side opposition comes up and compares Hitler's book to Disney. One of these does not pray to be a sensitive channel for this for the children to watch. One of these is a book that is a very highly politicized book, and then you're putting it against a TV channel that is meant for children to watch. How is this a fair comparison in a debate where we're arguing, where the burden on the proposition is to establish that the burden is to say that should Disney remove these from circulation? Because what the proposition is trying to argue is that removing from circulation will do a certain few things, which we'll get to when we're speaking of our clashes. Moreover, talking about the second speaker of side opposition, the second speaker somehow makes it out to be that the side proposition for some reason believes that removing all of these cartoons from circulation will end racism. Well, ladies and gentlemen, that is not our argument. Our burden isn't to prove that racism will end just because Disney removes a few cartoons. Our burden is to prove that Disney is responsible. And yes, they're not the babysitters for children, but they are responsible for the content that they put out for children. There is such thing as a corporate responsibility to work for the betterment of the society. And you cannot just come up and say that just because there's a lot of content out there, the ones that is out there, let it remain there because, well, there's more content for people to consume. That is not how racism works, ladies and gentlemen. Side opposition here would have you believe, and let me move on to the clashes of this debate. Side opposition here would have you believe three things. Side opposition says in their first line of argument that taking down does not solve racism. Yes, I agree with them there. Side opposition in the second argument says that not watching is not an option because people have a lot of different outlets where they can watch these things. Yes, what that side proposition believes that removing a certain cartoon from circulation will limit the ease of access with which you can watch these cartoons. How many children have you seen on the deep web? Side opposition. How many children have easy access to the dark web? Most of us don't have access to the dark web. And then the third line of argument presented by the side opposition would be that that people will find that taking down a lot of stuff, which is a lot of racist stuff, is just not feasible. Well, boo-hoo, racism will still exist. We just can't take down the racist stuff. Yes. No, it's not. Okay, no, sir, thank you. Moving on, right, ladies and gentlemen, so the world that side proposition is trying to build at this point is that we're not saying at any point, we're not saying that this will end racism for everyone. What we are saying that it will systematically incorporate into the minds of these multinational corporations. Yes, sir.
So fine, it won't end racism, but don't you think that steps should also be rational?
The step is rational. Removing a certain thing from, that is what I'm getting to in my clash. Side proposition is trying to argue and trying to make this argument for the case that, ladies and gentlemen, the idea that we're trying to present is that you removing these cartoons from circulation in our first line of argument will A, limit access, will B, allow for these racial minorities whose views have been offended to have some sort of reparation with an acknowledgement from Disney coming out and say, yes, we did that wrong, we will remove it. We will not continue to monetize on it. That, ladies and gentlemen, is a rational step that you could take. It asks and calls out for reparations. And moreover, the second line of the opposition, of the proposition, the second line of argument, it tries to establish that these minorities who have been working very hard to come up against systematic racism, when companies like Disney, who impact the minds of young children while they're in formation, when these companies get away with racist caricatures, and I'll give you a few examples of racist caricatures. We have Aladdin, where our side proposition began with saying that, well, it's barbaric, but it's home. They're talking about the Middle East, where cartoons like Dumbo have a crow named Jim, where Jim Crow was the name of the laws that were systematically put in place to enable systematic racism in the USA, where cartoons like Commando Duck and cartoons like Fantasia and cartoons like Lady and the Tramp promote stereotypical racism. Ladies and gentlemen, what we're trying to establish here is that we will curb it down. We will allow for minorities to be more accurately represented, and we will allow for them to have a safe space in the world. It will not end racism, but it will certainly make it better. Thank you.
All right, we would now like to call upon the last speaker of the match, the opposition whip.
Thank you very much, House. Thank you for inviting me to this interesting debate topic. Amidst COVID, we are still finding our sanity and hope. So my colleagues laid out a fair set of arguments in front of you to build our case. And as the last speaker of the day, I would like to share the compendium and recapitulate the main points. So the first speaker had shared their set of arguments, and they have defined racism. So taking down the content, I'm not exactly sure what was in details of taking it down. Do you want to remove it completely? Do you want to rewrite the history or the content, or so that the children do not have access of the real world around them? So that point was not really taken care of by our first speaker. So the second speaker had mentioned a couple of points that I would like to take on. The racist content that, you know, the children are watching the content and they get affected by it. They perceive themselves as how you are, how they are being projected there. But that is the important point. Because at that point, if someone intervenes and interjects their logical understanding and guides them through, that is the powerful point. You have to bring a stop to where it is affecting them. So if people are exposed to a certain point, if the children are being exposed to something which they are not aware of and they don't know how to tackle it, there is the point and the chance to rectify it, to gauge it in the better direction.
Point of information, Dr. Sandhu.
Yes, please.
Are we saying that for them to witness these cartoons being normalizing these racial stereotypes is okay for them to being aware of it? Because that will, of course, impact them in the very early stages, and it would all be normalized to them, no?
Okay, so I have a question for you on this front. Can you tell me, is it possible for the children that you have zero exposure to any extremity in our society or any society for that matter?
The argument is about the exposure.
So it's impossible for our children anywhere. So be it in a secure environment, be it in an insecure environment on the streets, anywhere, you are going to face extreme behavior in one way or the other. And if you say that the only way is to you just lay yourself in a cocoon and you do not do anything, that is not the great approach to move forward. So brushing it under a carpet is not a viable option in 21st century. There was one point by our last respectable speaker where they mentioned that children do not have access to dark web, right? So if they do not have, but their parents do have, right? So if the parents or the society around them in general is racist, how are you going to protect that? I do understand your point. I do understand your premise, but the premise is not grounded in reality. We have to acknowledge. For example, let me give you an example of our current situation, COVID. It is here for 1.5 years now. What are we going to do about it? Have we not survived? Have we not found our ways to work around it? Have we stopped our education? Have you stopped breathing? Have you stopped living? This is a brutal reality. And we are living with it. We have to find ways and means to combat with it, not to close our eyes and say that there is no danger lurking around us. All we need it to know is that, yes, racism is bad. I am not a proponent of this idea that racism is good and it should flourish in the society. But the point is that we need to acknowledge that it has immense opportunity to make it better for our students or our children in general. It should not be that it should be unguided attendance to those avenues. It should be guided. It should be monitored. It should be critically shared with them so that it does not impact them like a storm. You have storms around you. You have tsunamis around you. That is nature. and you say, no, I don't want to have them because it makes me insecure, that is not a mature approach, my dear opponents. So I have laid down these points, and I would like to reiterate the main points before I conclude my presentation. So we have contrived.
Point of information.
Yes, please.
Does the proposition say, does the opposition say that when something unnatural is normalized, does that make it okay? Like you said, when tsunamis are there are natural things. Is racism a natural thing here?
Again, this is a very good question, but again, can you say that many of the things that we as humans are composed of psychologically, they are not part of our nature? Being dishonest, being you know, a variety of different behaviors that we portray in our everyday life. I mean, I like your idealism, but that is not grounded in reality. Okay, so we have contrived our way to work around the problems, and we should apply that approach in everything, especially in our lives when we are dealing with our children. The children are our future, so we do not want to have a skewed representation of the world around them. I can give you my personal example. When I was abroad, I have had a very idealistic, perfectionist view of Pakistan. When I landed the country, I was shocked. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, the side proposition and opposition, for this rigorous round of debate. We would now be introducing the adjudication panel for today's match, which consists of Mr. Mahad Akbar, Anzal Abbas, and Wasik Imran. These people have been an integral part of HDU, and they have provided us a lot of guidance throughout our journey, a very limited journey, but and they have also been part of the former and the current council of HDU and Habib University Model United Nations. So we are very, very proud to have them here today. We would now be requesting the adjudicators to please proceed towards the results.
Okay, yeah, so the adjudicators will be taking around like 5 minutes to conclude towards the decision, and then we'll come back to you.
We would now like to call upon Mr. Marcelo Alves, the patron of Habib Debate Union, to share a few remarks with us before we officially proceed towards results.
Am I supposed to talk now or later? No, okay. So good afternoon, everyone. Once again, thank you so much for your presence here today. Again, it's a great pleasure for me as the patron of Habib Debate Union to see this place so full of people, although also taking all the safety procedures that our times demand. Well, I believe, I don't know if you agree with me, I believe the relation between students and professors, students and teachers is always a relation of power, right? Teachers speak, students listen, teachers assign grades, students try to comply with our deadlines and with our assignments. Teachers turn their cameras on, students don't turn their cameras on. So teachers in an in-person teaching, teachers are also standing, students are also sitting. So it's a relation of power, right? The relation between students and teachers is always a relation of power. And as I was invited to be the patron of Habib Debate Union, I believe that, I started thinking that one of the main roles of Habib Debate Union should be to not finish this power relation, because just like racism, these power relations, they take much more than just forgetting or prohibiting things from happening. But the role played by Habib Debate Union is to bring students closer, is to show that any student in any university in the world is capable of debating with his or her teacher on an equal basis, on the same level, and that these power relations that are entailed by in universities, in schools, do not stop students and teachers from arguing, from discussing, from reaching an agreement, or eventually from disagreeing, right? So what I expect all students, even those who are not a part of Habib Debate Union, is to bring this experience of debate to your classrooms or to your online sessions, is to question your teachers, is to challenge your teachers just like you did now, because this is sometimes something I miss in my classes. A student saying, hey, professor, I disagree with you, you were wrong, that makes no sense, right? And this is why this was such a good experience to see students challenging me, saying that what I said was nonsense, or that the comparison between Disney cartoons and Mein Kampf doesn't make sense, right? So I think this is the main role that Habib Debate Union should play. And I would like to thank each and every single one of you here for helping us achieving this such a noble goal. Thank you for the debaters, both opposition and proposition. Thank you for the audience, and thank you for all the judges who are having a heated discussion behind me. Thank you so much. Have a nice day.
We would now like to call upon Maryam Jamal, the president of Habib Debate Union, to share a few remarks with us, and then she'll be taking us to the final round of the results.
Hello, everyone. Firstly, thank you so much for joining us today, both in person and virtually. This event is extremely significant, not just for me, but for the debate union as a whole. The prompt that we choose being one of the most important, yes, one of the most least discussed issues. After the pandemic, we all saw a rise in the consumption of media, which in turn makes discussions like these extremely imperative. Moving forward, I would like to appreciate the efforts of my extremely dedicated EC who managed pulling off an event 5 days after coming in the office. I mean, I'm not including lost ID cards and injured toes over here. And towards the non-official HDU EC members who were also played a really important role in making sure that this event was successful. And I would like to express my heartfelt gratitude towards our patron, Professor Marcelo, who is quite literally the best thing that has happened to HDU in this tenure, and we were all talking about it. So thank you so much, Professor, for having faith in the team and this event. Otherwise, we wouldn't have been pulling this off in such a short notice. With that being said, thank you everyone once again for joining us today, and we hope to see you in the future HDU events. Now I would also like to call upon Mr. Anzal to announce the results for the debate.
Apologies to everyone, there is no answer announcing this result, but I'll try to do my best to fill in those shoes. All right, so firstly, thank you to both teams. That's my bad. Firstly, thank you to both teams for what was a very interesting and engaging debate. All of us felt that it was at the very least a difficult one to adjudicate, and that was not for having a poor quality of debate, it was for it being a very engaging one and a difficult one to assess, because both sides end up with arguments that are valid and well presented, and then the question becomes, how do you weigh one over the other? So the one thing that we all felt the debate could have done with a bit more of is a bit more characterization. What I mean by that is when people consume media, how do they react to it and why that is the case? Ultimately, this became a big consideration factor when we were assessing analysis and what seemed more likely to happen. But in general, it is always a good rule to characterize who your intended audience is and what their reaction is likely to be. But in the absence of that, let's get to the result. The two arguments that we end up having to weigh off is from proposition, the strongest argument which remains standing by the end of the debate, this notion that Disney should not profit off of bad representations, even if it is now being redistributed with a positive outlook attached to it. We don't think this is effectively responded to at opposition. However, on opposition, we have this notion that circulation does not happen in isolation. It doesn't just happen because the way that it's happening in status quo, but rather they introduce an alternative model for how it is likely to happen and talk about the critical notes that are attached to often controversial works of media, pointing to examples of Mein Kampf, for instance, and then talking about how this is likely to create a better engagement with the racist content that people are almost always going to engage with anyway. For the second argument, we think that our proposition had some attempts at rebuttal, but we didn't think they ever really took it out fairly effectively. So notions like the deep web deep web being hard to access were fairly responded to by opposition by talking about parents, or if people want to look them up, it's fairly easy to. So what we end up having to assess then is, to what extent do we credit the idea of Disney not profiting versus this idea of better representation and a generally better reception of this content? Ultimately, as the debate proceeds, both sides tend to focus far more on this notion of what side is better for these marginalized communities, what side makes their lives better and improves them significantly. Ultimately, proposition, despite having a good argument established, isn't able to demonstrate that this argument matters intrinsically more than the supposed benefits that opposition is outlining. So very happily, for the first time, I believe, the team that won this debate was the team for faculty in opposition.
So we would like to present team faculty with the trophy for this.